salute for that Veterans March past following the 2-minute silence at 11 o'clock. And of course, the royal family has a huge role to play today. It's a very important day in the royal calendar. His Majesty the King is Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces, both here in the United Kingdom and the other realms and territories in which he is head of state. Now, his wreath is actually going to be very similar to King George VI's wreath, his grandfather. He's going to be laying it at the Cenotaph. 41 open-style poppy petals made from bonded fabric, an arrangement of black leaves, which is traditional for the sovereign, and the ribbons will be bearing the King's racing colours, again, as is tradition, scarlet, purple and gold. As for Her Majesty the Queen's wreath, that is going to be laid on her behalf by her equerry Ollie Plunkett of the Rifles Regiment, and that's going to resemble Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother's wreath as well. So it's quite kind of harking back to 70-odd years ago when, you know, it was kind of almost the last time that a king laid a wreath at the Cenotaph. But of course, King Charles did lay a wreath at the Cenotaph last year, but this is the first time since the coronation. We're also expecting the Prince of Wales to lay a wreath, the Princess of Wales, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, and the Gloucesters are also going to be here on Whitehall for the Remembrance Sunday service.
Thank you very much for that, and we'll be coming to you later in the show. And as I said, we're going to be bringing you live all of the coverage from the Cenotaph. Now, before we do that, let's speak to Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, former leader of the Conservative Party, MP for Chingford and Woodford Green, and a veteran himself. Sir Ian, I'll ask you how you feel on a weekend like this, because I know you served in Northern Ireland, Rhodesia, you lost men, you lost friends. What are your reflections this weekend?
Well, this weekend is a peculiar weekend in a way, because although we have Remembrance Sunday regularly, it's very rarely, you know, that the 11th falls on the same weekend, so on the Saturday. So we have had 2 days in which this is a special a couple of days. We've done remembrances up in Chingford, where I am at the moment, and more to come later on. I always end up thinking of those who served with me, but also those that didn't come back. My father was a fighter pilot during the last war, 5 gallantry medals. He used to talk endlessly about the people that never returned, young men, etc. And a particular friend I remember didn't return back from Ireland, was very badly treated, his body's never been found. These sort of things go through your head as you go through these ceremonies, and that's what they're there for. They're there to give thanks to their sacrifice, and at the same time to be able to explain to your children and others why people fought to protect freedom, and that's really critical, I think.
Very critical. Now, I know you were very critical indeed of the pro-Palestinian marches taking place this weekend. From what you witnessed yesterday, do you think it was an error by the police to let them take place?
Well, I think the police will obviously have to stand by their decision and decide what they wanted. I particularly didn't want that march to take place then. It wasn't a case of saying no to marches. You know, they have the freedom to march. I know that. And that's what many fought for, those freedoms. But I think over this peculiar and rather special weekend, I would rather have hoped that we'd postponed it. Why not on the Monday? Why not on the Tuesday? That was my concern. It wasn't a case of pointing fingers. It's just that I thought that this would take away from what was a solemn occasion yesterday on Armistice Day, and today, of course, which is Remembrance Sunday. But I thought that was the right thing to do, and I had rather hoped the police on those grounds, would actually say, look, not on this day of days, but by all means march in 2 days' time or 3 days' time if you wish, and you're at liberty to do so. Others I know around Europe have taken a different view from us in this regard, and many of them have banned all marches outright, which I'm not asking for. I never have done. So it was up to the police. I hope that they will reflect on this.
Your colleague Suella Braverman's been criticised for saying that the police play favourites. She's referencing during COVID, lockdown objectors were given no quarter by the police, which we remember. Some police officers kneeled in favour of Black Lives Matter, and yet this is the stance that they've taken on these pro-Palestinian, or some say anti-Israel marches. Are the Met Police playing favourites?
I know a lot of police in my constituency and elsewhere who genuinely work hard for everybody in the community and try and protect them all. So I don't think they play favourites over this sort of stuff at all. I think there is frustration that in the earlier marches that took place, when there were very much lots of very anti-Semitic and pro-Hamas placards. And there were yesterday, by the way. I know others who've seen the marches and said there were quite a lot of anti-Semitic posters. And there were elements of concern, fireworks, you said all that earlier on. So but the police dealt with both, I think, and they dealt with them, I hope and believe, evenly handed. My view and concern is a march like that was always a problem in terms of provocation. And I know you should be free to march regardless of whether others dislike it. But I just thought on that day of days, we should just postpone that sort of thing and just have time to contemplate and think about, as I say, those who never came back, having given up their lives for their country.
What do you make of the criticism of the Home Secretary from within the Conservative Party? Fraser Nelson wrote an interesting piece for The Telegraph on Friday where he said, are we witnessing the breakup of the Conservative Party? Are we, Sir Ian?
No. I mean, political parties in the UK are coalitions completely, obviously slightly different views, generally coalescing around the main principles about what they believe. The same goes for Labour. Look at how many Labour MPs have come out against their own leaders' refusal to call for an absolute ceasefire, but instead for humanitarian aid moments. And I think that is critical. First past the post means you have to arrive with a party ready to govern, whereas PR means you do all that after the election. So we've always been a coalition. I don't think it's a breakup. I think there will be criticisms and there'll be defenders. But I think the main thing is the government able to deliver a stable economy in a stable country? And I think that is the key issue that's going to be at the next election. But no, I don't think the Conservative Party is about to break up anytime soon.
But what's your analysis of Suella Braverman's handling of this whole situation? I mean, you've been in a leadership role. Some people, even Grant Shapps earlier today on the show, has talked about questioning some of the language she's used.
Well, I'm a great believer in Teddy Roosevelt's great view, which is you speak softly and carry a big stick. But I can understand Suella Braverman's frustrations because she was worried. I had conversations with her before. She was genuinely worried that the provocation of one march would lead to other incidents, and therefore there would be issues. And so I think to that degree, and by the way, the Prime Minister was very clearly of a very similar opinion. He said that he thought it was disrespectful and that maybe they should be postponed. And I thought that was pretty much the right decision to take. So I don't think that when you get down to essentials, there was any great difference between the two of them, or for that matter, in the party's general view.
Let's touch on the events currently underway in Gaza. When the Australians talk about destroying Hamas, do you think that's operationally possible in the short term and indeed politically possible in the long term?
Hamas is a brutal terrorist organization that is dedicated to the eradication of Jews, but Jews in Palestine particularly. The chant from the river to the sea is not a nice, gentle chant. It is about eradicating Jews from Palestine. Hamas, Hezbollah, all these organizations are dedicated to that. One of the problems that we've got, and we'd all want to see the fighting stop, whether the Israelis are able to clear out Hamas, I suspect they will do a huge amount of damage to their ability to fight, having wrecked many of their command centers and also destroyed many of their tunnels. Whether every Hamas person will be eradicated is highly unlikely. But I think the key thing is that we don't see incidents like we saw at the beginning back in October, when Hamas was able at will to mercilessly kill, decapitate, burn Jewish people, Israelis, who were peacefully settled or partying. That must never happen again, and I think that is Israel's purpose. But whether they can absolutely eradicate Hamas, I don't believe so. But there will be many Middle Eastern states that will be very, very quietly behind closed doors, angry with the behavior of Hamas. And I think this may be the beginning of the end, hopefully, of the funding and support that takes place, particularly from Qatar.
But equally, there are going to be concerns, not least in the Western world, about proportionality and how Israel reacts to this without too many civilian casualties. We appreciate the argument about Hamas using people as human shields. But what does the Western world need to do to ensure that there isn't too much bloodshed, Sir Ian?
Well, keep on asking the Israelis to make sure that they do absolutely everything to avoid civilian casualties, even altering their targeting if they have any doubts at all. And I believe, by the way, that they are trying to do that. I really don't believe that they in any way wish to target civilians. The brutality of war is what it is, and it is a terrible thing. Every time you start fighting in built-up areas, you will always have civilian casualties. I would love like anybody else, to see an ability to have a ceasefire. But the problem, of course, is that how do you have a ceasefire with an organization that refuses to accept to lay down its arms or stop killing the other side? That is Hamas. Hamas has said they would not abide by a ceasefire. So that would mean the Israelis putting down their weapons, only to find they were then being shot at and more atrocities take place. So the key problem is it's a two-way process. To have a ceasefire, you must have both parties willing to stand by it.
Okay.
I think the best thing we can do at the moment is have humanitarian pauses and get that aid in, which is absolutely critical.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, I know you have to now go to commemorations at your local Cenotaph in Chingford, so thank you very much for joining me this morning.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Now, there's lots more to come on today's show. In a moment, I'll be getting the view from the Labour Party, and I'll also be speaking to the Veterans Minister, Ivor Kaplan. I'll be back soon.
Who is it?
We're here for the show.
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I. So you want higher taxes? Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Welcome back to our Remembrance Sunday special. Lots more to come as we build up to events at the Cenotaph. Don't forget, in this hour, I'm going to be speaking to a really inspirational veteran, Liz McConaughey. She went to Iraq when she was just 21 years old and went on to do 10 tours of Afghanistan. You'll be able to hear her astonishing story soon. But first, here's the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Camilla, thank you very much and good morning. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. The King will lead the nation in honouring fallen soldiers during a Remembrance Day service at the Cenotaph. A 2-minute silence will be observed at 11 o'clock and wreaths will be laid by members of the royal family, the Prime Minister, along with other dignitaries from around the country and the Commonwealth. A major policing operation remains in place after the disorder on Armistice Day. Defence Secretary Grant Shapps says today is not about politics.
There's a legitimate concern. The Home Secretary is perfectly within her rights to call for strict action to be taken, for the full force of the law to be used. I'm not really keen on the idea that in retrospect, whether it's the leader of the opposition or the Labour London mayor, that they then come in and try and politicise. This weekend of all weekends should not be about politics. It should be about the men and women who've given of themselves for this country. And that is what we should be talking about this weekend.
Meanwhile, the Met Police says it's actively investigating possible cases of hate crime following yesterday's demonstration. Hundreds of thousands of pro-Palestinian protesters marched through central London, which led to pockets of violence. 9 officers were injured, 126 people arrested, including 92 right-wing counter-protesters. The force has also released images of individuals they're seeking who were pictured carrying anti-Semitic placards. Now, the King has unveiled bronze sculptures of his late parents at the Royal Albert Hall. The moving tribute to the late Queen Elizabeth and Duke of Edinburgh was made as they arrived for the Royal British Legion Festival of Remembrance. The life-sized bronze artworks were installed as part of its 150th anniversary. The couple was joined by 9 other members of the royal family, including the Prince and Princess of Wales and the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh. And finally, a lion was seen roaming the streets of an Italian seaside town after escaping from a circus. The feline sparked panic among the locals when it calmly strutted through residential roads last night. After a 7-hour effort, it was eventually caught and sedated. This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying Play GB News. Now back to Camilla.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on Remembrance Sunday. I'll be joined by the former Labour MP and former Veterans Minister Ivor Kaplan in just a moment. I'm also going to be speaking to Liz McConaughey. She really has quite an inspirational story. She's the longest-serving female Chinook helicopter crewman in the RAF's history. We'll also be getting updates from the Remembrance service at the Cenotaph in London and others across the UK as we build up to the 2-minute silence at 11 a.m. Now, GB News reporter Jack Carson is at a Remembrance event at St Philip's Cathedral in Birmingham. Jack, what's the atmosphere there? I can hear the band playing in the background. Hopefully you can speak over it, Jack.
Yeah, good morning to you, Camilla. That's the Salvation Army band that's just short a while ago marched up here, and you can hear playing that music in the background as people here start to gather. Birmingham comes together every year for this Remembrance Sunday service for, of course, people, not of course just in the city, but the surrounding areas as well. The city itself has had a long-standing history, not only, of course, with the military, with over 8,000 men in the First World War going over to fight in France and Belgium in the trenches, but also in World War II, of course. It was part of the beating heart of British industry as we fought for freedom on the continent. Now, of course, here in Birmingham as a city, when people are coming together, of course, it's more recent conflicts as well, particularly for so many people here around me that I can already see around me here, the veterans proudly wearing their medals, who I'm sure at that 11 o'clock silence will have a very deep and personal moment of reflection as well as the community here does come together. We are expecting a big military parade. It was quite the sight when we had the rehearsal earlier of members of the Marines, of the Royal Air Force, of the Army and the Navy as well. They'll take the salute from the Lord Lieutenant, of course, after that service, and it's sure to be one of the spectacles. Of course, Birmingham is the second city as well, so of course all those events happening down in London, but of course here in Birmingham as well, those events really key for people to pay their own personal homages and personal respects.
Very much indeed for that, Jack, who is at the St Philip's Cathedral in Birmingham. Let's bring Ivor Kaplan into the conversation now. He's the former Labour MP for Hove. He was serving his constituents from 1997 to 2005, also served as Veterans Minister. He's a former chair of the Jewish Labour, and he's a patron of LGBT plus Labour. Ivor, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. You were in a government that did...
Good morning, Camilla.
Good morning. You were in a government under Tony Blair that did send troops to war. You must have been involved in those operational decisions. That must be difficult for a politician. You're sending lads and lasses out. You might not see them come back. What do you think about on Remembrance Weekend?
Remembrance Weekend is one of the most important weekends, in my view, in the whole year. And I think it's become bigger and better, I think, over the last few years, because people really do want to attend remembrance events, but at the same time, they want to be part of the past and the future. And I think that's created the Remembrance Day into such an important event, as it was yesterday as well on Armistice Day.
Reflect on recent events. I know you had this role in Jewish Labour, you are Jewish. Some of the scenes that we've witnessed, not just over the past 4 weeks, we saw again anti-Semitic tropes on the streets of London. What's your reaction to that, Mr. Kaplan?
Yeah. I think it's disgusting, and I think the Met Police have done a fantastic job in the last 48 hours. I think the key thing for the Met Police is to try and find the people who've carried things that we've seen online in social areas. We've seen on your broadcast this morning, you know, with banners that are absolutely 100% anti-Semitic. And that is an offence, and it needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be dealt with soon, and as soon as possible.
Yes, I'll actually flag right now, Mr. Kaplan, for our viewers and indeed our listeners, that the Metropolitan Police on their Twitter feed, on the website, have got images of people they would like to identify who are carrying some of these offensive banners. There's also a dialogue and a debate to be had about some of the representatives of the EDL disrupting things and making life very difficult for the police yesterday. But from a Jewish perspective, Mr. Kaplan, this is very, very difficult because your community is under attack from the left. I've got left-wing friends who are hanging their head in shame at those on the left who aren't condemning people who seem to be glorifying what Hamas did on October the 7th.
Well, I think in particular that what we've seen is groups of people saying really rather strange things in relation to what actually happened on the 7th of October. And it seems absolutely wrong that anyone should think that in some ways you can be supporting Hamas. And we saw some of that yesterday in the parade in London, and we've seen it over the last few weeks. It's not acceptable behaviour by anyone. They are an organisation that has been long banned from the United Kingdom, and therefore we all have a duty, irrespective of politics. We all have a duty to understand that and to make sure that what we are saying to the wider world is this is where Britain is and this is what we will do, and we will not support in any way Hamas, and therefore we do support what Israel has been doing in order to try and stop Hamas ever doing this again. That's the key thing.
Do you worry about a resurgence of anti-Semitism on the left? I mean, we thought that those days were over with the evisceration of Jeremy Corbyn at the 2019 general election. Obviously, he's had to take a step back from the Labour Party. But do you worry about this? Because I know that Jews are feeling very unsettled. Some have even spoken of the idea that they would feel safer right now in Israel than in parts of North London.
Well, North London obviously has a huge Jewish community and has done for years, as we all know. I genuinely think, I mean, I live in Hove and we have a sizable Jewish community who we will see this afternoon at the event there. But we want to make sure that Jewish people can operate in the right way that they want to do as individuals. Now, the way that this has been carried out by, in particular, some people, is to really try to suggest that in some way, the Palestinian thing is part of this. Well, it is part of this, but the key to this is a two-state solution. This has been Labour policy since 1997, and it will remain Labour policy as it remains Conservative policy for the future. And the way that we have to get to that is to bring together the two parties, and that's the Palestinian Authority and Israel. I believe we can do that. I'm not sure we can do that while Netanyahu is Prime Minister of Israel, because he doesn't really believe in that. But for me, as someone who passionately wants to see a safe Israel and a safe Palestinian Authority, and that means no Hamas, but it means the two places working together for the longer term future, not just of the Israeli people, but also for the Palestinian Authority people.
What's your analysis of Sir Keir Starmer's handling of some of the rebels in his own party who are calling for ceasefires, seemingly not able to explain how they would actually work in progress, in actual practice, when you're dealing with Hamas, a terrorist group that will never put down its weapons?
Yeah, look, there's no question you can't just put down your own weapons and let Hamas off the hook. That's what we would be doing if we did that. It's not acceptable. It's not something that the wider international community has any thought for at all. I think the way that it is being handled by the US in particular has been very good. I think the opportunity for humanitarian breaks in what Israel are trying to do in getting rid of Hamas, I think is a step forward, and I think we should support that. But just laying down Israel's a challenge to Hamas is not the way to do it. And I think what we have seen in the Labour Party, and we're perfectly comfortable with this, is we've seen people who actually didn't really want to be in the Labour Party that's changed so much since 2019. I think that's really the heart of this issue.
Final question, Mr. Kaplan. Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, was on the show earlier today accusing the likes of Keir Starmer and indeed London Mayor Sadiq Khan of playing politics in their criticism of Suella Braverman's handling of this weekend. Do you agree with them?
I agree with Keir Starmer and the Mayor of London. I don't agree with Grant Shapps. I don't think this is about politics. This is about ministers behaving properly. And she has misled a lot of people in the Conservative Party. That's up to her and the Prime Minister to deal with. But from a Labour point of view, I think it's right and proper to say that the comments she made in the lead up to yesterday were inappropriate for a Home Secretary. I saw that Michael Heseltine has also joined in and said that he takes that view. And I tend to agree with that view, that you can't be the Home Secretary if you want to be a commentator or a pundit in terms of what is going on in politics. That's not how it behaves, and it shouldn't be part of what happens in such a crucial week of Armistice Day, Remembrance Sunday, and allowing such a demonstration.
Although there are some in the Jewish community that welcome her description of the protests as hate marches. You know, some people are saying it's a pro-Palestinian march. Others are just saying it's an anti-Israeli, anti-Jew march.
Well, I've commented on some of that already with you, Camilla, but I understand why people say that. I would never use the phrase hate march. I have to say, but the Home Secretary did. That's not acceptable. And let's be honest, irrespective, surely the Prime Minister has to deal with this matter tomorrow morning, and that means sacking her if she won't leave.
OK, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning, Ivor Kaplan. Now we're going to go back to Cameron Walker, who's in Horse Guards Parade, soaking up the atmosphere there. Soaking perhaps being the operative word, Cameron. But I guess that, well, the crowds there are building up, and we're not now 45 minutes out from the minute silence, the 2-minute silence. Cameron, what are people saying down there to you?
Well, there's certainly a sense of camaraderie and solidarity here, Camilla. We're expecting just shy of 10,000 veterans from all three armed services here at Horse Guards Parade, waiting to line up to go on to Whitehall to, of course, line up for the 2-minute silence at 11 o'clock today. Because, of course, today is Remembrance Sunday, and I'm joined by two RAF veterans, Gus Murray and Nikki Burdett. Welcome to GB News. Thank you so much for speaking to me. Gus, if we come to you first. First of all, you were born on an RAF base, weren't you? Just tell me about that.
Yes, I was. So both my parents were officers in the Royal Air Force. They were based at RAF Northolt at the time, but I was born at RAF Halton Med Centre Hospital before it was torn down. So going back there for basic training when I joined in 2004 was something quite special.
So coming from quite a military family then?
Indeed. So both my parents, as I said, were officers. My father was a pilot, my mother was a finance officer. My wife is also a training officer, wing commander in the Royal Air Force at the minute. So a lot of military history in my family.
And did you serve in Afghanistan?
I personally did not. I supported military operations from Oman for Afghanistan, but that's as close as I got to it.
And you were deployed to the Falkland Islands, I believe, for the 30th anniversary of that conflict.
I was indeed. So I went down in 2012, missed the London Olympics here, but took part in the Freedom and Stanley Parade down in the Falklands in 2012, yes.
And just tell me about what happens when you were medically discharged and how perhaps challenging it was, that transition from military to civilian life.
So I was medically discharged, you said, January 2016. It was a bit of a tumultuous time. You sort of suddenly thrown into the unknown. Right, I've got to be a civilian. But it's a little bit of help from the Royal British Legion certainly helped point me in the right direction to the help that I needed in that transition.
So how important was the Royal British Legion to you in that transition?
Very important to me. So they pointed me towards the Veterans UK and everything in regards to support that I can get, and certainly the support that they still lend to families and those who are leaving the service, and those is really important work that needs to carry on. Definitely.
And tell me about your school friends, Jamie Hutton. What was he like?
Jamie was a right cheeky chap in school, and he joined the Royal Marines, but unfortunately was killed in a train accident down in Plymouth. He was with 42 Commando. He was a really lovely guy, really sorely missed, but to be able to attend his funeral was a right privilege to in there with a sea of Royal Marines. It was just one big family coming together. It's lovely.
Yeah, you were telling me about the camaraderie that you have in the armed forces, particularly at such a sad moment like that.
Definitely. We're all brothers and sisters, one big family. We've all come together to serve our monarch and our country, and we've all been there in the fight and still fighting to this day. It's lovely to come together as one to remember those who have fallen.
And Nikki, you were inspired to join the RAF by visiting a museum, I believe, with your parents at aged 8. I mean, what was it about the museum that inspired a career so early on?
That's right, Karen. Yeah, so I went to the Imperial War Museum with my mum when I was around 8 years old, and there was a WAF in the bunker, and she looked really glamorous, perfect hair, perfect makeup, looked really glamorous, and sort of really been able to cope under pressure. And I just thought, I quite fancy that, you know. I think I could do this job. I can sit and have a cup of tea and look glamorous under pressure. And in fact, the reality was something quite different.
Yes, I was going to say, was that the reality? But obviously not. What was your first job in the RAF like?
My first job was at 10 Squadron at Bryce Norton, so I worked with 200 engineers and I did the HR or admin for them, and it was really, really eye-opening. I was 21, I knew nothing about anything, to be honest, and working with the engineers was at the front line of wide-body aircraft activity was really quite something for a young girl.
And what was your highlight? What was the highlight moment of your RAF career?
I think it's hard to say, really, because there's been moments like this, moments like the RAF 100, where you really get a chance to celebrate and commemorate. But actually, highlights for me are the things that we've done right at the time, and that's things like evacuating people from Afghanistan, that's things like repatriating people from Afghanistan, because you don't get a chance to do that twice. You don't get to go again if it didn't go right the first time. So whilst they're very sad moments, they're real moments of privilege.
And that evacuation from Afghanistan, you're talking about what happened in 2021, quite a challenge, of course. So as you say, you have to really kind of get it right, don't you?
Absolutely, yeah. So we went forward to Minhad in the UAE to bring back the military people after the civilian evacuation was finished. We were as prepared as you can be in the military, and I said afterwards, actually, that was a job that I was least prepared for and actually most prepared for. We didn't know what was coming, but we knew we had the skills training and the teamwork to do the job that needed to be done.
Now, Nikki, you have a lot of medals. Why don't you explain to me just perhaps a few of them? I won't ask you to name them all, it's not a test, but what are the medals that you've got on your chest here?
So we start with the Long Service and Good Conduct medal with the clasp. So I'm very old and I served for 27 years, so that's after 25 years service. Then the Meritorious Service medal, then some Jubilee medals from Her Majesty the late Queen, and then we've got Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo and Yugoslavia.
Wonderful, well done. To both of you, you mentioned the Jubilee medals you've got, Nikki. How important is the royal family's relationship with the armed forces, do you think?
I think it's quite something, really. I mean, ultimately, when we join up, we pledge our service to the monarch and to the nation. So, you know, without pledging to that monarch, you've got nothing. It forms the basis of your commitment, of your sacrifice for yourself, to you and your country.
And it's 11 o'clock today. Who will you both be remembering? Let's start with you.
For me, everyone who has fallen before, it's a time to remember all the sacrifices that have been made. But as I said, Jamie and another friend of mine, Steve, will both be dear to me, and I'll be remembering them.
And what about you, Nikki?
I'll be remembering all our friends and family from the military family, but particularly the people that we repatriated when I was in Afghanistan.
And how important is it for the younger generation who perhaps do not remember, obviously, the world wars or the subsequent conflicts since? I mean, even the younger generation might not even remember Iraq and Afghanistan. How important is it to get the younger generation involved in remembrance in these kind of commemorations?
I think it's really important. I mean, veterans come in all shapes and sizes, and what we don't often see on the news is the work that the military people are doing in the background, and all of our security services, actually. We often don't see what they're doing in the background, so it's important to remember, just because you can't see it, it doesn't mean it's not happening, and it doesn't mean that people aren't putting their lives on the line every single day.
Nikki, Gus, thank you so much for speaking to us on GB News. Really, really appreciate it. Well, the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery will be firing their guns at the start and the end of the 2-minute silence here on Horse Guards Parade. As I said, 10,000 veterans will be taking part in that Veterans March Past as they go on to Whitehall to the Cenotaph.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Cameron. We'll be coming back to you a little later in Horse Guards as the atmosphere there mounts. Just as I was listening to Angus and Nikki's story there and how much they've been helped by the Royal British Legion, I just thought I'd look up our colleague Patrick Christie's Poppy appeal. He has now raised for the Royal British Legion £234,202. That appeal is still open. You go onto his Just Giving page. If you just Google Patrick Christie and Poppy, you'll find it. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could try and get that up to 250,000 and try and get $250,000 for our veterans? So do go and look up that online. It's also on the GB News website, of course. Now, don't go anywhere, because we've got lots more to come as we build up to the 2-minute silence at 11 a.m. We'll be back in just a moment.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Acquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle. Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute? Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christys, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christys, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. I'm delighted to be joined in the studio for the rest of this Remembrance Sunday special by Nicholas Owen, who reviewed the papers for me brilliantly earlier, former BBC and ITN presenter, and Michael Portillo, my fellow GB News presenter, but importantly, the former Defence Secretary. Before we go to both of them, let's speak to GB News' Northern Ireland correspondent Dougie Beattie, who's in Enniskillen in Northern Ireland covering events there. Dougie.
Well, good morning and welcome to a very wet and windy Enniskillen. This town has had many big relationships with the military over the years. Just out the road in Castle Archdale was the flying boats, the Sunderlands, the Canadian regiments that were there, lots of Polish regiments here in the Second World War. They will both be represented here today, along with the American consulate and the Taoiseach from the Republic of Ireland, the Irish Prime Minister. He will also be laying a wreath here. But really today, as much as it's remembering the war dead, it is also remembered because in 1987 the IRA put a vicious bomb in here that killed 12 people and injured 63, and the scars have stayed with this town forever since then. It is a very hard thing to get over that someone would have had so much intolerance for the poppy that they decided to carry out such a heinous terrorist attack at the time. So today will be really all about remembering those that fell, but also those that perished during that horrific terrorist attack.
Dougie, thank you very much. That's Dougie Beattie reporting live there from Enniskillen in Northern Ireland. Let me bring in my 2 very special guests. We've got a special panel for Remembrance Sunday. Michael Portillo, former Defence Secretary, and Nick Owen, formerly of the BBC and ITN. Lovely to see you this morning, chaps. Thank you for your time. Michael, let's go to you because you've been there and done it when you were Defence Secretary, preparing for what is, I would say, one of the most solemn events of the political and indeed military calendar as you prepare at the Cenotaph. Tell us what happens behind the scenes, because right now we've got Rishi Sunak and other key members of Cabinet gathering with the royals at the Foreign Office.
Well, I think those who gather are very aware of the honoured position in which they are. I went along as Defence Secretary. It's not even an event for all the cabinet. It's certain people are selected, and of course, it's not just the government either. The leader of the opposition is there. The leaders of the other parties. Any party that has more than 6 MPs will have a representative at the Cenotaph. So you go into the Foreign Office. This is clearly, even for people who are in the Cabinet, quite an unusual experience. So there's a certain amount of excitement, as well as preparing for the solemnity of the moment. You want to make sure that you look the part. Many, many years ago, Michael Foot, the Labour leader, turned up improperly dressed. And since then, people have had a kind of phobia. They want to make sure that they look the part. The royal family goes, I think, into one room. The ministers and the other party leaders go into another room. Certain amount of excitement there, because you don't necessarily often have contact with the leader of the SNP or the leader of the Liberal Democrats. So there's a certain amount of banter, or maybe exchange of information, even maybe doing a little bit of political business. And then comes the matter of getting the ducks in a row, because it's very important that people should emerge in the right sequence so that they fit neatly into the positions that have been set for them by the Cenotaph, Prime Minister first, of course. And I think cabinet ministers and party leaders are not the easiest people to bring to order.
Like herding cats, I would imagine.
So all this happens, and of course it all happens on an absolutely precise schedule. I can't remember now exactly, but it's something like 10:52 that we will see the politicians emerge, and then we'll see His Majesty the King emerge at 10:58. But it's all to the minute timing.
And we'll be bringing all of those live images from the Cenotaph as they happen later on in the show. Nick, I'll bring you in because I know you've covered a lot of these sorts of events in your career, but there's also a personal significance for you. Your father and your grandfather both served in the armed forces.
That's right, yes. Go back to my grandfather, my mother's father. He was in the cavalry in the First World War. The British cavalry was in a good position, really, because others were still sort of rushing across with sabres and doing terrible suicidal missions. The British Army cavalry's job was to pull the guns into position, and he would do that. He always loved horses, so it was an ideal job for him. You'd set up the guns and say, "Thank you very much, chaps," and he was off back, and that's why I'm here today, because, of course, he survived the experience. And then my father was in the Second World War. My father had been in the Royal Navy Reserve before the war, and so he was drafted straight away, 1939, off he went. He was in every theatre that mattered. He was Atlantic convoys.
Wow.
He was at Normandy, off the beaches of Normandy. All sorts of experiences he had. He was wounded very badly at one stage. At the very end of the war, he was in Australia preparing to go to join what was thought to be needed then, an invasion fleet to go and topple the Japanese. But that was finished by...
Did he speak to you a lot about it? Because I know lots of veterans kind of kept their counsel. It's a certain generation, isn't it, that don't necessarily share their war experience that easily.
Yes. I wouldn't say my father didn't talk about it, because he had a son who always knew he wanted to be a journalist, who always asked everybody questions, and my dad was among them. So I did know quite a lot about my father and what he had done. What I didn't really appreciate... And he left diaries as well. You weren't supposed to keep a diary on board ship, but my dad did, like a lot did, and I've read those as well. But what I didn't know about until he died, way back in 1981, far too young, my dad, his mother, my other grandmother on the other side, and a surviving aunt have told me the real stories about the traumas that my father suffered, not only being wounded and all the things that happened, but the difficulty he felt actually going to war. They were very open about it. My dad didn't go sort of happily marching off to war and all jolly good. He was bloody frightened, frankly.
Yes.
And it showed in the family.
Yes.
That's the sort of thing that tends to get forgotten about.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting because I look back at my family history. My grandfather, Ron, was a submariner. And I'm going to ask you about your tie in just a minute, Michael, because my grandfather, I never remember a day where he didn't wear his Royal Navy tie. He had a uniform even after he left the services, and Grandad would be in his grey trousers, in his blue shirt with his naval tie and a blue V-neck jumper. Every single day he went on to be a woodwork teacher in Hertfordshire. And equally, there's a story on my other side of my family. My stepmother's mother, Ruth, was an Auschwitz survivor. And, you know, we tried to build up a picture of what she had gone through, the horror of what she went through. And I went to Auschwitz for the 75th anniversary of the liberation there. And we tried to piece together her story, but she was too traumatised to say much about it at all.
How extraordinary.
But, Michael, I know that recently you've been doing your work with the Commonwealth Graves Commission, War Graves Commission.
Actually, I was filming in Normandy a few days ago, and I had the occasion to go to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission War Grave at Bayeux. It is the most moving thing. It's rather vast, many, many headstones, and in common with all the 23,000 sites around the world, I think I can say, certainly all the ones that I've visited, it is superbly kept. So every tombstone is the same, apart from what is engraved upon it. They are arranged in absolutely precise lines. Only certain flowers and plants are planted, and the grass is left a little long, so that it doesn't become muddy with the visitors. The gardens are beautifully kept, and there is a central monument. But as you walk along the lines of the tombstones, what was so striking was the names of each person killed, and so often age 19, age 20, age 21, killed on the 6th of June 1944, or on the 7th of June 1944. These men were killed as they hit the beaches for the liberation of Europe. And the work that is done by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in maintaining these graves all around the world is exemplary. And I think they mean a great deal to people, because so many go to visit the graves of their fathers, their grandfathers. Yes. This is an enduring interest, and I think they're so gratified when they arrive there and find that these places are perfectly tended with enormous respect for the dead.
Also, I think when you see the scale of how many graves there is quite something, isn't it? We're just hearing there the military bands piping up as crowds gather, as you can see. On the radio, we've got the Whitehall Scenes building now as we prepare for the 2-minute silence at 11 o'clock. Now, I'd like to bring into the conversation an extraordinary woman. We're delighted to have her on the show. As I said earlier, Remembrance Sunday really is about speaking about veterans and what we'll be talking about remembering today. She was a Chinook helicopter crew member and is a veteran of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. She first served at the age of 21. Liz, I hope you can hear me. We're so delighted to speak to you this morning. I'd like to begin by just asking you, what do you think about and what do you remember on Remembrance Sunday, Liz?
Well, for me, you know, I served for 10 operations in Alperic. The Chinook force as a whole, we deployed there the entire duration of that campaign. And part of that duty was the MERT, which was the medical team. We collected weapons off a lot of the soldiers off the battlefield who had been injured, and many, of course, who paid the ultimate price. So my thoughts always turn to Remembrance Sunday to them, to those 403, I think it was, in the end, soldiers that lost their life in Helmand. We saw them all, and I thought it generally always went that direction.
And you had an extraordinary role to play, didn't you, Liz? Because you were in the medical emergency response team. You had 10 deployments to Afghanistan. You had 2 to Iraq. There was one point in 2008 where you were based at Camp Bastion and you made 14 sorties out to bring injured service personnel back. It was highly traumatic for you, Liz.
Yeah, and that's in the early days in Alperic. Actually, the MERT was fairly quiet because we didn't have that many British boots on the ground. But as the years went on, we injected more and more British troops into Helmand Valley, and that meant that it was obviously that the MERT became more and more kinetic. So that was sort of the busiest year and the busiest time was that 14 shouts in one day. My darkest day on MERT, we picked up 5 guys who had all been killed in one go from the rifles. And I think, you know, we started to normalise what we were saying, and it certainly took its toll in the end. You know, it was like scenes from MASH at one point, and for many of the people who were out in Camp Bastion, we would bring any of those injured and fallen soldiers to the HLS.
I think we've just lost Liz. We will try and get her connection back. No, she's still back. Liz, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can still hear you, Camilla. Yeah, we bring the soldiers into the Nightingale helicopter right there, and many of the other people walking around Camp Bastion would know when the aircraft were coming in, because we'd go to that specific landing site. And I think it always used to hit every soldier in Camp Bastion quite hard when they saw the Merc come in.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I suppose at the time, you're trying to be completely focused on the task in hand. You're doing what you need to do. You're possibly even behaving in a quite robotic manner in order to just get through from day to day. But Liz, as you wrote in your book, Chinook Chick, which was published in 2022, you did find that all of this caught up with you. Tell us about how you suffered with PTSD, and you did attempt to take your own life during the pandemic, Liz.
Yeah, and that's it. When we were doing the job, we had a job to do, and we couldn't think about who was inside the body bag. They were just the most precious piece of freight that we had to get back to Camp Bastion. And then many years later, whenever I guess the world got quiet, that's when my thoughts started to get loud. And one night, whenever I developed insomnia during lockdown, I found myself looking up a lot of those soldiers who played the ultimate price on the back of my aircraft, and looking them up with my logbook and through Google to humanise them and find out if they were married, were they fathers, were they sons. One chap had got engaged before he deployed to Op Herrick and never actually made it home. And I knew all the warning signs were there, that I wasn't in a good way, but I didn't reach out for help. I think that's the case with a lot of veterans, is that we feel like we need to do it on our own, and we don't want to burden people because, you know, we feel like we should be able to solve our own problems. So I never reached out for help. And then in the August in 2020, I actually took a huge overdose and tried to end my life just to get rid of the noise that was just bouncing around in my brain.
I mean, that must have been absolutely awful. You subsequently found out that you had. I mean, obviously you were in a haze at the time, but thank goodness you'd called the emergency services and I believe the Samaritans, and they came and saved you. But to reach rock bottom and get to where you are now, Liz, how have you done that? Because you've had an extraordinary difficult time since you left the armed forces. Have you been supported enough? Do you think the veterans do have enough support, Liz?
Yeah, and I was very lucky. I don't remember making any phone calls. And actually, I think that proves that there's a will inside us all to want to survive, no matter where you are in terms of depression or PTSD. There was something subconsciously made that phone call that saved my life. And yeah, it's been a battle since I left hospital. I remember thinking it can't get any lower than this the day you try to end your life. And actually, I was completely wrong. And I was about to start the hardest battle of my entire life by putting it back together. And there's no two ways about it. I've learned more about myself in the last 3 years putting life back together than I did in the 17 years in the military, because, you know, I've learned more about who I am as a person without the uniform. And there's so many great forces charities out there that help me do that. Certainly Help for Heroes in Combat Stress have been instrumental in that. And it's a shame that it does fall to the charities, but I feel quite privileged in that respect because I know that the civilian system isn't quite so quick.
Do you think that there is enough support, particularly for younger veterans? I mean, I appreciate on Remembrance Sunday, we usually think about older veterans and those involved in the First World War and indeed the Second World War. But do younger veterans, people who have left the armed forces in more recent times, do you think they're supported enough by the state, Liz?
That's a really good question. And actually, you know, I find it harder and harder every year. And so actually, I've seen someone, a good friend of mine, posted that today on his social media, that he said, why does Remembrance Sunday get harder every year when it should, with the passing of time, get easier? And I think there's a younger generation from Iraq and Op Herrick who definitely, I think it's still very raw for them. And they're certainly, you know, repackaging what a veteran looks like. Because I was a veteran at the age of 37. And I think, you know, just I don't meet the typical what a veteran looks like at the side of the Cenotaph. And I think, yeah, there needs to be a bit more support in terms of just, you know, helping those people bond as well. And equally, look at what happened yesterday. The noise in London yesterday was drowning out the silence, and that was shameful. That yesterday all we did was spend all day looking at what was going on instead of actually like embracing the stories of veterans and celebrating a lot of those positive stories that come out from the military as well.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your very difficult, but in the end, very positive story, Liz. Thank you, because I know it's a very important time for you today to remember the colleagues that you've lost. So thank you very much indeed, Liz McConaughey. And as I say, her book, Chinook Chick, is a really, really quite astonishing and extraordinary read. Let me bring Nicholas Owen, the former BBC and ITN presenter, back into the conversation, along with Michael Portillo, the former Defence Secretary. Now, Michael, you spoke earlier about what is happening right now. Let's just take the audience through the timetable. So right now we have members of the royal family arriving at the Foreign Office. They're going to be joined by politicians, key politicians, as you would imagine, the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, the Leader, as you say, Michael, of all of the main political parties in Westminster that have secured 6 or more seats. The procession is going to begin at 10:52. That will leave the front door of the Foreign Office building to take up positions around the Cenotaph. That's led by the crossbearer. We're just looking at these live pictures now, and we can see Rishi Sunak's wife there. She's on the balcony overlooking the events, joined by, I believe, I'm squinting to see, but I think that might be the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester there, waiting for the King, of course, who's going to be leading these commemorations. Michael, it is a different period now. We're in the Carolean era. We associate these events so closely with Her late Majesty Elizabeth II. Having said that, the King, with his own military history, with 2 sons, one who served operationally in Afghanistan, he is carrying on the mantle, and we know that this event today, we actually saw him looking quite emotional last night at the Festival of Remembrance at the Royal Albert Hall, because they unveiled bronze statues of both of his parents. This is of huge significance to the King, isn't it, Michael?
Yes, well, whatever questions people might have about the succession of Charles following Elizabeth, no one, I think, questions that the military element is absolutely solid. The royal family in the person of the King, His Majesty the King, and his sons, and indeed the King's brothers, and indeed the King's sister, they have all absolutely attached themselves to the military. They are devoted to the military. So there is no question mark there whatsoever. There's absolute continuity in this respect. And the armed forces will feel absolutely inspired to see His Majesty the King laying his wreath today, and a wreath being laid on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen as well.
And interestingly, Nick, the Queen is going to be here. She's going to get an equerry, a man called Oliver Plunkett, to lay her wreath for her. We have seen that in the past. Sometimes older members of the royal family don't necessarily lay their own wreaths because, at the end of the day, the Queen is 76. Also, the Duke of Kent. Now, he typically, again, a military man, would have laid his own wreath. He's leaving that to an equerry because he's now one of the oldest members of the royal family. But what's interesting, I think, is this passing down the generations. We're not going to see the Prince and Princess of Wales's children here right now, but at the same time, it's important that those younger members of the royal family carry these traditions forward, isn't it?
It is. And just talking about birthdays, of course, the King himself will be 75 on Tuesday. Yes, our oldest monarch and all of that. Yes, interesting. I mean, the Queen in her later years often didn't feel able to actually lay the wreath herself. But as Michael was saying, this very, very strong connection runs right the way through. The cenotaph itself, very, very interesting. And the word comes from the Greek, means empty tomb. And of course, it is to the soldier whose remains could not be identified. A reminder that particularly the First World War, the number of people killed was absolutely colossal. And so ever since 1920, when the cenotaph was first brought into service, if you like to put it that way, King George V was there. Monarchs have always paid their respects, and it was then for the soldiers from the United Kingdom and the British Empire, as it was then, and then just after the war, Second World War, 1946, it was rededicated, and eventually, of course, became for what we now call the Commonwealth. So that stone there represents so many millions. I mean, I think it tends to get forgotten just what a proportion of this country's young men, almost exclusively young men, and of course quite a few women as well, perished in those terrible wars that we have seen, and subsequent wars too. We've been fighting wars, let's face it,
yes.
Almost ever since. I don't think we're involved in anything just at the moment, and let's pray that we are not involved in anything in the future.
It's taking on more significance, I think, Michael, because of what's going on in Ukraine and because of what is now going on in the Middle East.
Yes, I mean, this Remembrance weekend, I think, is unlike any that we've experienced for some years because of those two wars and also because of the events in Britain over the last week. And Liz McConaughey didn't make this point a moment ago, but I think in a way it was implicit. You know, we're quite happy as a nation to remember the First and Second World War, but we're kind of less keen to talk about Iraq and Afghanistan. And yet, You know, our service people made the sacrifices in just the same way as it was demanded of them in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it is terribly important to remember them. And not only to remember them, but also those who bear the scars, like Ms. Begolaki.
Yes.
I thought her testimony of the work that she was doing, bringing back the bodies of the fallen and what she has suffered since, was really moving. And she's a relatively young woman, and she's a veteran, and it has obviously affected her life in the most terrible way, the most extraordinary way.
You're hearing the sounds at the Cenotaph there. We're watching images of the Cenotaph. We're about 3 minutes out from the procession leaving the front door of the Foreign Office building. That's going to be led by the cross-bearer. We are going to be seeing, of course, the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, the SNP Westminster Group Leader Stephen Flynn, Leader of the Liberal Democrats. We're also going to be seeing DUP leader Geoffrey Donaldson. We're going to be seeing, of course, as well, former Prime Ministers. So John Major's going to be joined by Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson and, albeit briefly, Liz Truss and others. I mean, it's an interesting sort of image of, I think, public life, this, Nicholas, because we're obviously seeing people in official positions. We talk about members of the royal family and indeed politicians being public servants, but we're also seeing, once again, this military spectacle of people gathering to remember. And these are people who are giving their lives and their times to king and country.
Absolutely. I mean, look at all those, all the military people, all those soldiers there. As Michael was saying, you know, the wars that have been fought since, who knows what we might be calling upon them to do in the future. And so you're quite right. The other thing, you don't very often get the institution of monarchy and the institution of politicians sort of coming together in this way, something that we're all agreed upon.
I'm just going to just give some description of what's happening just there at the entrance to the Foreign Office. Those younger people there who are lining and are basically producing a guard of honour there for the VIPs that are just about to come out are the King's Scouts. They perform a traditional role. My understanding is the Scouts in general have a huge presence here today, and those who are the King's Scouts are the ones who have done the most service in the Scouts, and they get a special award because they're so dedicated to the cause. So that's why they're there now. It's we're about 30 seconds off, we believe, from the procession leaving that front door. As we can see there, people just gathering, waiting. A bit of nerves in the background, I'd imagine, Michael, as people just get in line and make sure they're in the right place.
The music, of course, provides some of the cues. I think we're hearing Elgar's Nimrod at the
Yes.
moment. The music is becoming more and more sombre as we approach the moment when the 2-minute silence will begin. And so everyone inside the building is, as it were, called to order by the strains of the music that they're hearing playing from Whitehall.
And just to recap as well, the service today, the service of remembrance, is going to be conducted by the Dean of the Chapels Royal. That's Bishop Sarah Mullally. She was appointed Bishop of London in 2018. She became a Privy Councillor and took her seat in the House of Lords in 2018. She's got a really interesting history, Dame Sarah. And here we see the cross-bearer leading the procession now. We can see the King's choristers there, who are from the City of London School. These are the same choristers that sang at the coronation, and we see the clergy there leading the procession out of the door of the Foreign Office.
After the 2-minute silence, there will, of course, be a brief service of remembrance led by the Bishop of London.
If you're just tuning in, this is a GB News Remembrance Sunday special. We are seeing live images now from the Foreign Office door as this solemn procession begins to enter the area at the Cenotaph. We're about to see members of the royal family and indeed key politicians and party leaders assemble for this ceremony. I was just saying Dame Sarah has this extraordinary background because she used to be the chief nurse of the NHS, so she went from nursing to being ordained, and she will be carrying out today's service.
We're now listening to Purcell's As I Was Laid. I think one of the most sad pieces of music that's conceivable, the end of his Dido and Aeneas.
Thankfully, it looks as though rain has held off. Earlier on, we saw umbrellas. Don't see any there now.
Yeah, so we've just seen the Lord Bishop of London, as I say, and the Chapel Royal Choir, the General Officer commanding London District and his staff leaving the Foreign Office. They're going to take their places in the north-east of the Cenotaph, and then momentarily, just in seconds, we're going to see the procession led by the Prime Minister leaving the Foreign Office onto Whitehall.
The refrain of the music is "Remember Me," which is, of course, what the day is about.
And here, of course, we see Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, accompanied by Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. This isn't a day for party politics. This is a day for politicians to come together. Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, behind him with Stephen Flynn, who's the Scottish National Party Westminster Group leader.
Very smart, if I may say so. They've learnt their positions and they've come to order in an almost military fashion.
We can also see there Geoffrey Donaldson, the leader of the DUP. He's joined. Next to him there is the Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle. We can also see Lord McFall, who is the Lord Speaker. Next to him is James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary. And next to James Cleverly is a woman who has courted some controversy this week, Home Secretary Suella Braverman. In the second row there, we can see our former Prime Minister. There's Boris Johnson, as distinctive as ever. He's joined by Sir John Major. Sir Tony Blair is also there. The Right Honourable Gordon Brown, he's alongside David Cameron. We just saw Theresa May, she's on the second row next to Boris Johnson. Liz Truss also there, despite her brief moment in office. And then behind them, we're going to be seeing key members of the Cabinet. We're going to be seeing the Secretary of State for Defence, Grant Shapps, and others. less than a minute now to the 2-minute silence as the King and fellow members of the royal family arrive at the Cenotaph. We're just seeing the King now, His Majesty the King, laying his wreath at the Cenotaph, following the last post being sounded by the buglers of the Royal Marines. This is the Queen's equerry, Oliver Plunkett, who's laying a wreath on her behalf. The Prince of Wales now laying his wreath. Next to lay a wreath is the Duke of Edinburgh, formerly known as Prince Edward, the Earl of Wessex. The Princess Royal now laying her wreath. She and her husband, Admiral Sir Tim Lawrence, will be meeting with veterans after this Cenotaph service. And this is the equerry of the Duke of Kent laying a wreath on his behalf. We can see His Majesty the King there in his Royal Air Force uniform. The royals lay their wreaths first, and then they will be followed by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak leading the commemorations. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak now laying his wreath. The leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, now approaching the Cenotaph to lay his wreath. This is Stephen Flynn, MP. He's laying a wreath on behalf of both the SNP and Plaid Cymru parliamentary group. The leader of the Liberal Democrat Party is the next to walk solemnly to the Cenotaph and lay his wreath. Yugi Beattie in Enniskillen. And this is the Right Honourable Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party and the leader of the DUP in the UK House of Commons, laying his wreath. The Speaker of the House of Commons, laying his wreath. He's representing there the staff of the House of Commons. And we're shortly followed by his House of Lords counterpart, Lord Macfall. Lord Speaker. He's laying his wreath on behalf of Parliament, representing members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Person to lay a wreath, or the next people to lay a wreath, are James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary. He's accompanied by Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary. They're laying their wreaths together on behalf of the intelligence agencies. Now that the politicians have laid their wreaths, we're going to see representatives from the Crown dependencies and the United Kingdom overseas territories. They're going to lay their wreaths in one group, followed by 47 High Commissioners, or their representatives, who will lay wreaths in 5 groups. They will place their wreaths in turn on the bottom steps of the west side, then the top and bottom steps of the south side, and finally on the top step of the east side of the Cenotaph. Nick, what are you?
I was very struck. Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, came forward. He's a Hindu, very proud Hindu. And it made me think, and we should all recall, that we're not just talking about people from this country who serve and have served and have perished in wars that we've seen, but so many people from across the India, Pakistan, those countries, South Africa, Australia. Enormous contributions.
Yeah, with that in mind, after these representatives from the Crown dependencies and the overseas territories have laid their wreaths, it's always significant, isn't it, Michael, that as well as the Ambassador of Ireland, the Ambassador of Nepal lay their wreaths, and of course, as well as representing their own areas, it's the Gurkhas when it comes to the Ambassador of Nepal and the contribution over the years that the Gurkhas have made to the war effort.
Yes, it's tricky to name Commonwealth countries because the contribution was, I think, from all of them, and it's a very large number of countries. We mustn't forget the contribution, for example, from the Caribbean, from Canada, and so on. I was very struck earlier hearing from Enniskillen that the Taoiseach of Ireland is in attendance at the act of remembrance there. Of course, in the First World War, we were still a United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and many Irishmen died fighting for the British Empire. And then many of them were not much remembered in subsequent decades. And there's been something of a turning back on that so that the Irish do remember those who fell for the British Empire during the First World War.
You're listening and watching GB News with me, Camilla Tominey. I'm joined in the studio by Nick Owen and Michael Portillo as we take in these extremely moving scenes from the Cenotaph in London. At the moment, the images that you're watching are of representatives from 47 different Commonwealth countries. We've got 47 High Commissioners or their representatives laying wreaths in 5 groups at the moment at various sides of the Cenotaph monument. Very solemn scenes, and I think, again, seeing the royals, the contribution of the royals to the military. We know how important it was to the late Queen. Nick, the King there, you said to me earlier about how emotional he seemed last night at the Royal Festival of Remembrance at the Royal Albert Hall. Tell me about that.
Well, he was... I don't think tearful was quite the expression I would use from the pictures I've seen, but moved, of course, yes, emotional about it because, well, he saw there his parents, a reminder of all the things that they did and all the military that his father was very, very much involved in as well, and a Queen showed her devotion to the armed services on so many occasions. All these events sort of coming together on this weekend, aren't they? I'd like to, if I may, just say to Michael, you in the studio, you've actually been there, you've laid a wreath, Michael. It must be an extraordinary moment to look back on, and your feelings at the time, wanting to get it right, of course. There's a lot of ceremony involved, but also your own personal feelings stirred up about your own family and so on.
My father, of course, was in the Spanish Civil War. So one side had a very particular experience of war. When I was Defence Secretary, of course, we were losing British soldiers. British soldiers were still being